What makes a role-playing game? Is it the character creation, the progression, the storytelling, the camaraderie, or the pretending to be someone else? Is it all those things and more? But what can make someone who likes such things sit down to the table with a measly board game that has pesky rules and doesn't let anyone unleash their wicked imagination? My name is Benji, and this is the top 10 games that would scratch the itch of a role-player RPGer, or whatever the correct nomenclature is. First, some ground rules though. This list could easily be filled by games using the name and imagery of popular role-playing games, such as Dungeons & Dragons and its estranged cousin Pathfinder. And even from the more homogenous IPs like Warhammer, Star Wars and Call of Cthulhu. As such, any board game that also shares the copyright with an existing tabletop role-playing game is not eligible. No, what we're trying to do with this list is disseminate what makes people enjoy role-playing games and finding games that translate that to varying degrees into the confines of a traditional-ish board game. The list we're about to embark upon is ordered in terms of complexity, from least to most brain-burning. And so, with waffle over, let's count from 1 to 10. Number 1, Legacy of Dragonholt. Okay, so maps are boards, right? Yep, thought so. This is what we'll call an advanced choose-your-own-adventure game, and it's about as RPG-light as you're going to find. Strip away the GM, the dice rolling, and the nuanced character progression, and you have this Oracle game system set in the Fantasy Flight Games world of Terranoth. Imagine up your character and some base proficiencies and equipment, and off you go on this narrative campaign adventure. Broken down into modules that act like parts of an overriding story, this puts the storytelling and choices you make front and centre. Dragonholt will be a great shout if you want an RPG solo, and if you want something that bit more accessible for those RPG phobes in the friends and family circle. Number 2, Call to Adventure, is a tile-chucking, no, I'm not joking, set collection game that weaves the story of your very own protagonist. Setting off with just a couple of starter abilities, your origins, motivations and destiny are how the story is told. Unfolding with the traits you pick up and the challenges you undertake. The runes themselves represent the 6 characteristics you know and love from D&D, like strength, intelligence and dexterity, and will help you overcome challenges throughout the 3 acts of the game. The one thing that strikes me about Call to Adventure is that it's a game that only reaches its potential by leaning into the stories of your characters and sharing that narrative around the table, something that role players should have a field day with. Number 3, One Deck Dungeon, is a dice rolling dungeon delve that sees you picking a class and knocking down doors to see what trials and tribulations stand in your way. Each trap or big ugly you tackle will see you rolling dice representing different attributes, which you'll then place over corresponding squares to ensure you suffer as little in the way of consequences as possible. Each victory will see you upgrading your stats, gaining new abilities, or bolstering your stash of equipment. And it's the retro vibe that's going on here that reminds me of some of my first interactions with role-playing games in the form of the old video game dungeon crawls like Dungeon Master and Eye of the Beholder. In other words, plenty of exploration, encounters and character progression. Number 4, Forgotten Waters, deviates from swords and sorcery and sails to the high seas and piracy. And it does so in the sweet, glorious confines of a spiral-bound storybook. Oh, and the accompanying app. Yes, there's plenty of over-the-top voice acting, and the app isn't as be-all and end-all as in some games. The combination of personal and common goals is always there to provide you with difficult choices, and the mishmash of mechanics never threaten to add up to an overly complex game. The roles you play on the ship, the movement, the worker placement are all cursory, and it's the mechanical smoke and mirrors that belie the fact that you're pushing the story forward with a bunch of skill checks and letting the narrative unfold organically. Number 5. Roleplayer is undoubtedly the game for you if you get bored in role-playing games after you've created your character, because this little piggy takes dice rolling and placement and attaches them to your character player boards, where strength, dex, int, wisdom, con and charisma sit proudly aside your alignment and race. You see, each player board will have certain objectives to get you the most points. It wants you to have 18 strength, be chaotic good and have certain coloured dice in the 3 columns for each attribute. So you'll be rolling dice aplenty, manipulating said dice and visiting the market to pick up equipment that will help you achieve your objectives. All the while never straying from you and your avatar's overall makeup. Number 6. City of Kings is for all intents and purposes a puzzle game, and I wrestled with its inclusion because there's another game you could level the accusation at that most people will expect to be on this list, and it's not. You see, the one thing that will appeal to role players, outside its exploration, semi-random scenarios, randomly generated monsters and character progressions, is that it's not overly burdensome to learn, and doesn't lend itself too much to analysis paralysis. It feels open world despite its small map footprint, and there's enough to the objectives you face in each scenario to give you a purpose and an end goal to be able to picture the leap between tabletop role-playing and that same theme and vibe in a board game. Number 7. Folklore: The Affliction does not have that puzzle feel, and is a natural progression from City of Kings because this gothic horror set scenario driven adventure game leans heavily into more familiar character progression and wonderfully transitions from big open world maps to tight location specific encounters without batting an eyelid, evoking that sense of travel you'll find in most tabletop RPGs, and opting as well to upgrade from a D&D 20 to a D100 as the means to resolve almost all the skill checks and combat in the game, sees you playing a game of stacking the odds in your favour, whenever and wherever you can. I can honestly say this is the closest facsimile of what can make role-playing games and board games convivial bedfellows. Number 8. Too Many Bones. Well, the clue's in the title. This is a dice builder RPG that distills your characters, here strange looking fellas named gearlocks, into a tech tree type setup with the bespoke dice for each character, which is really just a selection of different classes, each having their own facings and resultant uses depending on how you roll. That distillation of a character is also mirrored in the venue for your encounters, here trimmed down to a 4x4 gladiatorial grid, with the bits in between the encounters providing the surface layer narrative choice. It's ultimately the experience you gain as you go that powers up your characters, and there's enough in the way of initiative based tactical combat to ensure this innovative idea hits much more than it misses. Number 9. Gloomhaven is the first dungeon crawler on this list, a genre of board games that quite naturally appeals to the role player in us. It's all there really: character selection and evolution, exploration, scenario objectives, combat, and all in a fairly rudimentary mechanical form. Why Gloomhaven makes this list, outside of its laundry list of critical accolades, is that it's got a massive amount of content just in the one box, meaning that there are endless possibilities for you and your play group, whilst there's been nothing there to stop you playing this all on your lonesome. The game's encounters rely heavily on initiative, Picking what to do when does make this a much more strategic affair than you might normally find in tabletop RPG land, but the yays are going to assuredly beat out the naysayers. Number 10. Sword and Sorcery. Just when you come across one dungeon crawl, you find another comes along almost immediately. But what sets this apart, like Gloomhaven to its contemporaries, are that its enemies are AI driven, which I can see doesn't necessarily sell it to a role player, but this actually adds to the unpredictability of combat. The story driven elements feel much more like you're choosing your own destiny and pushing your own narrative, which is not always prevalent in this type of game. Yes, there's a lot to remember, and there's a reason this is the most complex game on the list, but that only adds to the immersion. So if Gloomhaven is the card-driven dungeon crawler of choice, this could easily be the role player's go-to dice rolling affair. Oh my word, this list was hard to whittle down. As such, it would be appropriate to dole out a couple of honourable mentions right here as a form of epilogue. The name, of course, that most people might have expected to have made an appearance was Mage Knight. But with its somewhat lacking in theme and story, and with its propensity towards analysis paralysis, I wouldn't be entirely confident recommending this to a role player. Fallout, the board game, was another that would have made the list, with its exploration and storytelling and post-apocalyptic theme, perhaps taking City of Kings' place in the list. But the main reason it didn't is because it's a competitive game, whereas most role-playing sees you at least the bulk of the time pointing in the same direction as a team. I was also conscious that a fantasy setting would spend too much time in the spotlight, and I did my best to showcase some other settings, but games had to get into the top 10 on merit. However, one more game that could have made the list was Shadows of Brimstone, City of the Ancients. A good old-fashioned dungeon crawl system, and this time set in the wild, wild west. But there you have it, 10 bloody good games any avid RPGer might like to lean into, should they fancy some straight-up board gaming. Alas, that is the end of this here tale. My name has been Benji, and this is him telling you that this video has ended.